Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 19. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all of our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Bob Fu. Bob was born and raised in mainland China. While working as an English teacher, he was a house church pastor until he and his wife were arrested for quote-unquote illegal evangelism. In 1996, Bob and his wife fled to the United States as religious refugees and went on to found ChinaAid in 2002 to bring international attention to religious persecution and human rights violations taking place in China. Over the years, ChinaAid's mission has evolved to one of exposing human rights abuses and promoting truth, justice, and freedom by advocating for religious freedom and rule of law in China. ChinaAid works for the immediate release of prisoners of conscience, equips human rights defenders and religious community leaders with religious freedom and rule of law training, rescues and resettles persecuted leaders and their families, encourages families of prisoners of conscience by providing financial assistance, and exposes abuse by featuring unique stories of persecution and injustice on ChinaAid's website and through social media. In 2013, ChinaAid celebrated the publication of Bob's memoir, God's Double Agent. Bob, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on the program. I've been blessed to know you for some years, and I knew of you during the Bush administration when you were making your journey. I heard of you as settling eventually in that wonderful patch of Texas, Midland, that is known for having the highest per capita number of churches in all of the United States. So certainly a good place for someone to celebrate religious freedom. But Bob, let's talk a little bit about how you came to be here. Obviously, you grew up in a very different time and circumstance. One, people in the millennial generation might not even have any sensitivity towards or knowledge of. But talk a little bit about how you grew up and what you were thinking and how things took a turn for you to have to make this kind of journey.
Yeah, Steve, I'm so glad to be with you today. I was raised in mainland China in a very poor farming family, and then basically witnessing and experiencing the massive inequality, injustice due to the system of communism. That's why I kind of went to the Tiananmen Square in 1989 and as one of the students leaders from my university. And after the bloody massacre and crackdown, I then became a follower of Christ as a Christian in the later year of 1989. And that's how I became an underground church leader. Eventually, in 1996, both my wife Heidi and I were arrested for the so-called illegal evangelism, as you just mentioned in the introduction. So we were tremendously blessed by the miracles of God that enabled us to escape from China after we were released from prison and essentially became refugees to the United States of America during the Clinton administration time. That led us the establishment of the Ministry of ChinaAid, primarily is to work with those who are persecuted because of their faith and their dedication to human rights and rule of law. That's kind of the story in a nutshell.
Well, Bob, you've had a fascinating personal journey in really living the subject matter that informs what you advocate on policy. And it led your personal journey led you right into an organization that many policymakers actually have come to know, and maybe many Americans have too. But could you talk a little bit about how ChinaAid came into being and a little bit of what the journey was like, about what its initial mission has been and the circumstances of those times? But if you look at the 2000s till now, a lot's changed in China, a lot's changed in America, and maybe some things have changed about ChinaAid.
Yeah, it is, Steve. I mean, you were back then working in the vice president office in the White House. I was a refugee and a seminary student at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. But every day kind of got information. Back that time, fax machine was still working, so I was
Yeah.
still receiving fax and things like that about the persecution in China. Many of them, I know those pastors from underground church, the house church leaders kept telling me, they are being arrested, being detained, and being tortured simply, of course, for organizing a house of worship, organize a prayer meeting, and sometimes on a Saturday night, it was the daytime of Sunday in China. I would hear the cries, from those brothers and sisters when they were being attacked by a group of the public security officers in the middle of their worship. I could hear their chairs were knocking down. They were telling me, said, Pastor Fu, please pray for us, please help us. I came to the U.S., of course, already started enjoying the very fabric of religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of association, assembly back that time. And how could I, sit silently and sit quietly without at least, getting, my phone and calling a few brothers and sisters, Christian leaders, to pray for them and also to speak up for them. So that's how the Ministry of China Aid started. Really, that's back to the year 2002, when we learned actually one group of house church with 5 church leaders sentenced to death. And so that was the launching day, kind of the New Year's day of 2002 in the Congressional Retreat Center in Osprey Point in Maryland. I think from that time on, I mean, basically, we started engaging the exposing of those persecution, and then encouraging those who are persecuted by supplying them both the financial support for the family prisoners and hiring lawyers for legal defense, and also engaging the rule of law training and biblical worldview trainings as well. So that's kind of the pillars of this ministry. And certainly you at that time, to the Bush years, had made the religious freedom as one of the top foreign policy initiative. That helped a lot. I remember, back to the Clinton years when we came here in the 1997, and it was a hot debate on the renewal of MFN, most favored nation, right? And then the WTO, and then President Clinton, I think, certainly made a huge strategic mistake. We continue to fail today, right, by delink the human rights with the trade and other business initiatives that gave the CCP upper hand in reaching themselves while continuing the persecution.
Yeah, well, I certainly remember those debates, and I'd be the first to say that anyone who wants to do a Google research on the writings in my name at that time and the organization I worked at were advocates for normalizing trade relations because of the theory and the bet that was made that in doing so we would speak bluntly about the evil of the Communist Party, but we thought that engagement, development, prosperity would expand the zone of freedom for individual Chinese citizens, and that maybe that would put more moderating pressure on their government over time. Obviously, a bet that has proven in 3 decades to be misplaced. Reality is very, very different.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, I wish you were the majority
Yeah,
with but usually the minority sees the best,
yeah.
unfortunately. And
Well, it's
yeah.
hard to admit you're wrong. And some of our most powerful people have the hardest time admitting they were wrong.
Mhm.
And so to me, it would have been better to be correct all along, but it's a greater sin to realize that you were not correct and refuse to change because of some ego issue or reputational concern. We have to be guided by facts and truth. And I think that certainly what you lived was increasingly getting into the ear of meaningful policymakers. So, in the beginning parts of ChinaAid, talk a little bit about what your audience was like. You mentioned in the 1990s there was this freight train of normalizing trade with China, and that did have the effect of marginalizing human rights to a degree. After 9/11, it changed everything, so to speak, and that somewhat marginalized China policy for a time. And but you in this issue set found ways to access some of our most important leaders even during that time. So talk a little bit about who you were reaching, the kinds of people in Congress and in the executive branch that even though policy by and large wasn't moving the direction that you or I might have wanted, there were some leaders that we wanted to hear your message and they were getting it from you.
Yes, Steve. I mean, back to the Bush 41, Bush 43 years. I mean, that was the golden time in the sense of the sympathetic voices from policymakers, from both the National Security Council to President Bush himself. And of course, in Congress, there's still a group of very principled leaders, like former Congressman Frank Wolf, Congressman Chris Smith, I mean, who's still serving, and many others. I think that was at least the time that we find from both the policy level and the lawmakers. They are very, very focused on the religious freedom issue, and certainly um, every time you remember when we organize a delegation from China, consist with human rights lawyers, with underground church leaders, we were always invited to the White House at the National Security Council with a very attending listeners, the audience from those in the president circle. And President Bush personally told me, he said the reason he actually scheduled most of his visit to China by passing a weekend, a Sunday, so that he can schedule a Sunday worship in a government-sanctioned church. He said he couldn't go to a house church, and he wants to make a point to the Chinese people. Even the President of the United States can still practice his faith, believe in God, and religious freedom is an inseparable value of the American national fabric. Certainly, is part of the universal values.
Right.
And I think inside China, now compared to the current dictator Xi Jinping, I'm sure we will touch on that.
Yeah.
Despite of the ongoing persecution under Jiang Zemin and later on Hu Jintao's time, they were very responding. The Communist Party leaders to the U.S. pressure, to the U.S. Policy initiatives. We got so many church leaders and even top political dissidents were released, right? Because of that kind of a top public and private diplomacy. And now it's a total different scenario and reality.
Yeah, well, I think it's very, very different on both sides of the U.S. China relationship. And that's frankly a bit sad to see. I think that what you witnessed and lived, and what I was trying to work with back at that time, was when a president is going to advocate for a wide variety of things in the relationship with China. Maybe I agree or maybe I don't agree with what he wants as a priority. At least make it clear and genuine that this issue of religious freedom is a personal priority, and go in with some specific actions that the other side might take. And if they fail to take those actions, that there would be consequences in the personal relationship between the leaders and the policy relationship between the countries. And whatever our assessment of George W. Bush might be on public policy and even on China policy, there really wasn't any question that he was personally committed to his faith and that he personally wanted to demonstrate the power of a leader of a great nation acknowledging a power greater than he. And so he would talk honestly about beginning the day on bended knee, about not being able to carry the burdens of office without appealing to a higher power, but making clear that God and faith and salvation was much more important than the political and government office that he held. And so he meant that. He lived it. Was he perfect at it? None of us are. But it sure was an asset to U.S.-China relations and to the people of China, I would argue, to have a president do that. We don't have a president that will do that now. So hopefully our audience, in looking at who our next president would be or should be, will think on these things. But also, I think you had and your colleagues who remain in China in underground churches and otherwise have seen a profound change in Xi Jinping. He is a different kind of leader. He doesn't respond to these appeals the way Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin did. When Jiang Zemin was trying to repair China's relations after the Tiananmen massacre and the sanctions that followed, he had an incentive to listen to what a president was going to listen to. Yeah. And Hu Jintao was still in a time of transition, and we went through a financial crisis that affected the United States and China. He still felt, I think, some need to listen to what a U.S. president says. Arguably, Xi Jinping doesn't seem to want to listen to anybody. What's your take? We'll jump ahead to that subject matter of how different is Xi as a leader of the Communist Party? Which parts of this problem are the Communist Party changing and getting more powerful? And how much of this problem is the kind of leader Xi is in transforming the Communist Party?
Yes, Steve, I'm glad you touched on this issue of different leadership, with the different emphasizes and then making really the difference in different level. I even when during I think the end of Bush years, I was quoted by Washington Post in terms of their China policy. I gave a F, a fail. I received a phone call from a good friend in the National Security Council. Said, "We have done so much." I said, "Well, I think that the entanglement with business interest was shown on across the party lines, right?
Yeah.
Both the Republicans and Democrats are guilty of those appeasement and, of course, the aggressive of corporate greedy American companies who became lobbyists essentially for the CCP's agenda. I think not only for the economic interest, some became the kind of volunteer for the CCP's ideological interest almost, right? You can sense that. I remember one of Frank Wolf's aides told me, said, back to the 1990s, at least there's some voices of deferral from Congress whenever there is a bill against the CCP's human rights record. But then when you get into the 20th century, she told me, said, whenever there is a bill on China, even 90% are positive, 10% are kind of negative. You have tens of millions of dollars from U.S. companies lobbying to kill it, right? I think it happened both in the Bush time, Obama's time, and certainly during the even Trump's time, there was heated battle. But I did see there is a major shift during the President Trump's time compared to the previous several administrations. Partially, I think you have to see the President Xi Jinping's own policy. They didn't help their own allies, kind of quote unquote allies in the greedy corporate America. Yeah, and by launching almost a cultural revolution 2.0 by having the human rights, religious freedom basically reached to the worst since the Cultural Revolution. They didn't help. I think their allies here in the U.S., their lobbyists, and I think American and to the West society in general had a major wake up. And plus, I think the policies from Secretary Pompeo to, of course, President Trump's. Remember the first time we have the International Religious Freedom ministerial summit in the State Department. I mean, hosted by the Vice President Mike Pence, by Secretary of State on stage and inviting those victims of persecution, and also establish this International Religious Freedom Alliance. It's almost, I call it the Earth NATO. It's a religious freedom NATO. The like-minded share with the same value, and that alliance continues. I think that tells to Xi Jinping, tells to those dictators, persecutors, that religious freedom is no longer just a talking point on the bilateral or multilateral human rights dialogue, right? This dialogue turned to be really useless and fruitless. It's just talking under the table. And but it became the highest level, or at least one of the highest level national foreign policy initiatives. And you have President Trump invited these victims to the Oval Office, talk with them for 1.5 hours with our friend, also his appointee Ambassador Sam Brownback at the presence. So I think there is some wake-up call in general in public that reinforce, I think, translate into the foreign policy in the U.S. Government, and also other countries like in the UK, Hungary. Even our ally Taiwan, they established an ambassador at large for international religious freedom.
Right.
That gave us a lot of, I think, room at least to pursue and to help religious freedom as an issue. And I feel, unfortunately, compared to the previous administration, I think both in President Obama's time, especially during the current President Biden's administration, it kind of went backward in terms of foreign policy, religious freedom in the foreign policy. Don't you think, Steve?
Well, I think, Bob, you've really touched on a couple of very important strategic issues that I hope the audience really digests. One, we had kind of an established policy that assumed that you had to make a priority some form of engagement, probably commercial engagement, as an area of broad consensus. and that if you push that and minimize, marginalize, but don't allow other issues, whether they're human rights or national security, to disrupt that, that somehow we, both the United States and China, will grow out of our problems. And that kind of engagement policy, as it became to be called, was really at tug of war with a strong undercurrent of reality that said, you know what? We can advocate for those kinds of policies on the economic side if we choose, but there is no reason, and in fact, it's harmful for us to censor ourselves on these other issues that matter. And the Chinese are really sensitive about these issues being raised. And people in China can be encouraged if they're raised and they see the leadership have to accept it. So what I saw is during the Trump years, there might be areas where I might have said or done things differently, but really it was proof that they could pursue a significant new trade agreement. And at the same time, the president could meet with victims of persecution from China and to make clear that as Americans, we are going to stand on these moral issues and they're going to be the policy of our country, and that Beijing is not going to keep us at a senior level from engaging on these topics while continuing to pursue these other interests, whether it was concerns about North Korea, whether it was concerns about unfair trade. All these things were going to move forward. But what you described was the official parts of the government launching key initiatives to speak out in ways that the American public hadn't seen for a long time, and the Chinese public could see it. But I trust that you agree with that assessment, Bob. But if you could help us better understand, how do your friends who remain in China, who are in underground churches, how do they see these kinds of things? A lot of people might wonder, after all these years, I mean, after all, Tiananmen Square crackdown was a lot of years ago. The pursuit of you came after that. Many others have had to flee. A lot of people might be surprised in the surveillance state that is today's People's Republic of China. How can underground churches even exist at this point? But talk a little bit about that reality under today's Xi Jinping, and how do people in those networks see what we're doing, and what do they think?
Yes, I mean, inside China, of course, our brothers and sisters, the house church leaders, and even above the ground churches, under Xi Jinping's brutal leadership, dictatorship, they are across the board being persecuted. One of the first war dictator Xi Jinping launched since he took office was a so-called forced demolition of crosses campaign. Basically, all of a sudden, overnight, a wooden cross on the rooftop of the church building was designated as a national security threat, as the enemy of the state. And you have the government mobilized hundreds of thousands of bulldozers. Basically, went in front of the church's gate and attacking the church and demolishing, burning, destroying all these crosses. And on the rooftop, those church leaders, most of them, those churches who have a church building are government sanctioned, so-called Three Self-Patriotic Movement churches. So when those leaders were kind of blocking or in any way not cooperating with the government demolition campaign, they end up being imprisoned, and some were sentenced to 10 years, 14 years imprisonment for not working with the government to tear down their cross. So this is kind of the thing that we see the Communist Party has been fought against. It's really uses Ambassador Brownback's word is CCP launched a war against the faith, against the God. For the first time since the Cultural Revolution, we have seen millions of Chinese Christian children were being forced to sign a Communist Party prepared form to renounce their faith in public. And for the first time, we have seen the government basically mandated all the churches have to put a portrait of Chairman Mao. I mean, under whom at least 80 million people died, and Chairman Xi Jinping's portrait being put on the pulpit of the church. And the congregation were forced to sing the Communist Party's national anthem before they sing doxology during their worship services. So, I mean, this is really a cultural revolution 2.0, maybe 3.0, it's worse. And let alone, as you mentioned, the surveillance, the kind of every church, both four corners of a church building and in front of the pulpit and outside the church at the building, the face recognition cameras have to be installed so that they can recognize and sort out if there is any body under 18 years old who are forbidden to enter into the church building. Were there, and otherwise, I mean, or if there is a Communist Party members or military service member or any civil servant or any educators, teachers, these are so-called 5 forbidden policies, not allowed to enter into a church building. Otherwise, they all face serious consequences from losing the public benefit to losing their job or being kicked out of their schools. So this is happening right now, I mean, in China. So, but our brothers and sisters, I mean, they knew, of course, this is the nature of the CCP. They just want to control and destroy any even perceived, even spiritual enemy. So it's just, in a sense, you know, as a fellow Christians, we know it's a spiritual warfare. It's not a battle of flesh and blood. But at the same time, I think we know that the revival among the churches will continue. Actually, continued. You know, my friend Pastor Wang Yi, who President Bush actually met in the White House back to 2006. And he then became a house church leader, and he was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment for preaching the Gospel of John 3:16. God so loved the world, and that, I mean, he offered that love to Xi Jinping, and by also asking him to repent for his persecution. And my Chinese American friend, Pastor Zhang Tao, received 7 years imprisonment for setting up 16 schools in the Burma-Chinese border area for 2,000 children who otherwise would not have an education opportunity. 7 years imprisonment. They're still serving. So this is the current reality. But we know, nobody, in this world, no matter which party, which ideology, could challenge the Word of God, could challenge or remove the church. Maybe physically they can destroy, but we all know, the church can never be destroyed as the body of Christ. Yeah.
Well, Bob, you've done a great job of highlighting the reality of what some of the current forms of oppression and persecution are. I think it's extremely important for people to hear them, and the list could go on much longer. Because often in everyday American life, all people hear about are maybe a property bubble or big mega projects or supply chains and manufacturing platforms and things like this that get very far away from the human experience, much less the spiritual experience. And this reality, in my assessment, you and your organization researched this in much greater depth than I, but in my assessment, this has gotten worse, coincident with Xi Jinping's rise in power. And I think with the weaponization of government, which is not a surprise in the Communist Party, but with the advancement of technology, using the tools that used to be ones of liberation as actually tools of surveillance, I think that is another area where I think friends in the audience might wonder, what can we do to help as private citizens? What can we do in various non-government organizations? But what can we do to push our governments to be more effective, knowing that Xi Jinping has effectively, tragically shut down Hong Kong, what used to be a relatively free society, free for religious worship as well, and now is trying to coerce Taiwan. And, as you address this, talk a little bit about the internationalization of this effort, because people of faith who flee China aren't necessarily safe once they're out of China, whether they're in Australia or in the United States even. And you've lived an element of this too. But how can people be effective given the sort of growing strength of persecution in China, if my assessment is right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you covered basically, the range of the issue of CCP's both domestic threat in China, and certainly it's a global cancer, right? I mean, the kind of what is known as the CCP's long arm, the transnational repression, actually even make the FBI set up a headquarter office on the CCP's transnational threats in the U.S. soil.
Yeah.
And so that is being felt every day. We in American soil, in the UK soil, certainly part of the European Union soil. So I think that's in a bigger picture. As we started the conversation, I mean that was a consequence of our miserably failed policy by naively thinking appeasing the CCP by having more trade, giving them more technology, more money, would be incentivize them for automatic democratization, automatic middle class. I mean, where's the middle class in China? They're all kind of became the peasants class. I think now the CCP is in perhaps the worst major financial economic crisis, right? I mean, since their reopening in 1980s. And the where is the democratization? And everybody from the left and right, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International to Family Research Council, we all recognize the human rights and religious freedom has reached to the worst level, right? Instead of any improvement, and we forgot even mention about the concentration camps, right?
Yeah.
The CCP engineered in the West China that, according to the Pentagon's estimate, between 1 to 3 million of predominantly ethnic Uyghurs and Kazakhs, and including some Han Chinese Christians, are being in the modern day concentration camps by the CCP. So I think in terms of what can we do, I mean, certainly, as a man of faith, we certainly should encourage people to keep remembering them and to pray for them. I mean, that can make a whole lot of difference. As the Hebrew 13 in the New Testament said, remember those who are imprisoned as if we are their fellow prisoners. I think if one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers, the church metaphor. And secondly, on the policy level, I think we certainly need to learn a hard lesson that the more you appease CCP, the more aggressive they will become. I mean, how much did we get after we grant them WTO status? MFN first, then WTO, and they are not satisfied with enslaving their own 1.3 billion people, and they already extended their long arm. I have friends in New York City. Some we rescued out of China, just simply went to the Lower Manhattan, held a simultaneous welcome ceremony of President Tsai Ing-wen from Taiwan when she made a stopover, and they were physically beaten up. I mean, 3 of them were sent to the hospital because of that. Those the bulliers, I mean, those thugs were all sent by the Chinese embassy and consulate. I mean, there is a public record on that.
Yeah.
So I think we should really take note of that. And the CCP also set up their own biolabs in California, right? Who knows how many more in other parts of the country. Overseas police stations in New York City, even in Texas, other states. So we should ask the policymakers to really, to take a very principled and strong push, get rid of the Confucius Institute, get rid of those overseas police stations, and make clear to Chinese government that if you continue to do this, it will impact your economic, and the supply chain and many other issues. I think the U.S. cannot tolerate. I mean, they are enforcing so-called, their own kind of CCP laws in American universities, right?
Yeah.
From Princeton to the University of Florida to Purdue University. And the Congress should pass, new, really enforceable bills to have the administration really to set up very straightforward policies to hold the CCP accountable every time they are doing this. So I think we can have a list on and on, but the bottom line is we should hold our ground, right? Our value cannot be bented. I feel so sad when I see her here. Then Secretary Hillary Clinton went to China and telling the Chinese that, the priority is climate change, nuclear issue, economic issue, human rights, almost like a secondary issue. While we agree, those other issues are important, but we can't differentiate our core for values, our constitutional freedoms as a kind of easy to bend or sacrifice and to be compromised. And that sent a wrong signal to the dictators that certainly discourage our brothers and sisters and those who are persecuted, who actually love America, I think, more than many who are in America are doing. I think that is certainly during this COVID time, you saw the leftist ideology are rising up. Suddenly, the communism, socialism became a fashion to be promoted in the society. That's very dangerous. I think we should certainly American people should be on alert.
Well, I think that there's been a number of areas where we should have had a wake-up call in the past, and we didn't heed that wake-up call. And it sure looks like today there are a few issues that have been a wake-up call, and more Americans and their elected leaders are starting to take note. I don't know that we're all the way to where policy needs to be, but there does seem to be a rising coalition of interests and forces that sees the Communist Party of China as the greatest enemy of the Chinese people, but also the greatest threat to the American way of life. We have new opportunities on Capitol Hill with the Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the CCP in the House of Representatives, where we can have a different kind of conversation. I hope that our audience would be advocates for continuing, expanding, and amplifying the kinds of international religious freedom conferences that we've witnessed in government and the private sector. I congratulate you, Bob, and others that have participated in both those public and private sector gatherings. I know there'll be another one in Taiwan, and that was a great demonstration effect that when the United States leadership goes out onto this subject area, our friends and allies see the way, and they do it their way. But it's important for all of our allies to know that we care about more than just hard power, and that we can talk about more than just a prosperity doctrine, but we can talk about the real value of human beings, human dignity in their souls, and that is a great form of legitimacy that shakes the foundations of the Communist Party, which is why they hate those activities. But I think, Bob, you've lived those things. I'm so glad that you were willing to come and join the podcast to talk about the substance and the personal journey. There's a lot more that I'd like to talk about and have the audience get to know more about your work and ChinaAid's work. And hopefully we'll continue this conversation in the future. But for now, for those who want to follow your work and ChinaAid, where should they go to engage and support?
Thank you, Steve. For those of you who wants to join the fight for freedom, for liberty, for religious freedom especially, come to www.ChinaAid.org, ChinaAid.org, and we can really play a role in both supporting those who are persecuted, but also advancing religious freedom, rule of law in the policy level. As Steve just mentioned, we are heading to Taiwan to host Taiwan International Religious Freedom Summit, along with the Speaker of Taiwan Parliament, Speaker Yu, and the whole really Taiwan Parliament join the cause. And together, you can engage with the actionable items. Besides prayer, you can give support for those family prisoners, rule of law trainings, legal defense, and certainly you can join us as volunteers for advocacy in your local community, set up a prayer meeting or advocacy a group to help the lawmakers in your community to understand the issue and push for the concrete actions to tackle this biggest threat, existential threat to not only America, I think to really our civilization, this Chinese Communist Party.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. I think a truly worthy cause for people to invest time and treasure if they are so inclined. To our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Bob for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.